Hello, everybody, and welcome to History Bite number 326, dated November 23rd, 2021. I'm Walter, your mobile historian and blue-collar scholar. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This History Bite is entitled Francis Scott Key, Esquire, The Man Beyond the Star-Spangled Banner. Before I begin, however, I'd like to formally invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Juarez Lee Shelton, M.A. And in addition to that, please also click on that little notification bell immediately to the right of the subscribe button. In doing so, you will receive notices when I post new, exciting, and enlightening videos in history, law, political science, theology, and philosophy. Thank you so much in advance. You are the best. So again, this video is entitled Francis Scott Key, Esquire, The Man Beyond the Star-Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key is an American historical figure who commands a special place in the hearts of many, largely because of his abilities as an amateur poet. Indeed, that is because most only know one thing about the man, that he was the author of the poem Defense of Fort Mchenry, which of course would be renamed the Star-Spangled Banner and be formalized as America's national anthem in 1931. Outside of that, most people, save historians that is, know very little about the individual who was Francis Scott Key. He had lived a notable life for 35 years before he wrote that great poem, and lived another 29 years after that time. Like many of his era, Key was a complex figure in many ways and did not just disappear into oblivion after performing the act for which he is most known. Well before and after the War of 1812 and the Battle of Baltimore, which elevated him to prominence, he was a successful lawyer, statesman, and public official. This video gives a brief biographical account of the man who was Francis Scott Key, including and beyond the Star-Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key was born on the 1st of August, 1779, in Terra Rubra, Frederick County, now Carroll County, Maryland. His father, John Ross Key, was a lawyer, judge, and had been a commissioned officer in the Continental Army. His mother was Anne Phoebe Charlton Key, a housewife and devoted caretaker of the family. Key spent his youthful years on his family's plantation with several slaves who were an integral part of daily life. The family was very humane to their slaves by the standard of the era and the location. A legend held, though not confirmed, that Key's grandmother was blinded by smoke while rescuing a black family from a severe fire. Additionally, his mother read the Bible to their servants at their estate. This treatment was where he would develop his benevolent attitude toward his own bondsmen, many of which received freedom at various points in his life. Key attended and graduated from St. John's College and read law with his uncle, Philip Barton Key. He would be admitted to the Maryland bar and practiced law in Fredericktown with his colleague and future brother-in-law, Roger B. Taney. At age 22, he married Mary Taylor Lloyd, in January of 1802, often referring to his wife as Polly. Together, they would have 11 children. They were as follows: Elizabeth Phoebe, Maria, Francis Jr., John Ross, Edward, Anne, Daniel, Philip Barton, Ellen, Mary Alicia, and Charles Henry. He was a devout Episcopalian and attended Mass at Christ Church in Georgetown. His special location to sit and pray was pew number 40. Always considerate of the downtrodden, Key attended conferences of various religious and philanthropic endeavors throughout his life. In his youth, Key almost studied to become an Episcopal priest as opposed to a lawyer, but most likely for financial reasons, he chose the latter. He was against gambling and many other commonly accepted vices of the day. All in sum, Key was a genuinely religious man and did his best to instill said piety in his children. He was not always successful in this endeavor, as two of his children in particular, Daniel and Maria, were not exactly inclined to spirituality. Two sons, Edward and Daniel, would die under tragic circumstances. The former was pulled undercurrent one day while wading in the Potomac River near the Key Estate in Washington, and the latter died as a result of a gunshot wound from a duel. Adhering to faith, Francis Scott Key would comfort his wife with the deeply rooted belief that their losses and what it produced, such an awful shock, all right, as this could not be ordered by a merciful God, but for some wise and good reason. So the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner is the single event which brings Francis Scott Key into the hearts and homes of Americans. For many also, it is the only thing in which they know about the man. On that British warship in Baltimore Harbor, in their minds, that is where Francis Scott Key was born, lived, and died. Truthfully, one could call it being at the right place at the right time, as Francis Scott Key would have almost certainly preferred to be elsewhere during the firing on Fort Mchenry by British warships. As an officer in the War of 1812, Lieutenant Key had been present at the disastrous Battle of Bladensburg and had witnessed the burning of Washington, D.C. by the British Army. The would-be legendary poet was on a peace mission to obtain the release of a close friend, Dr. William Beans. This is why he was on that ship, to witness the firing on Fort McHenry. Beans had been imprisoned by the British after the burning of Washington, after heckling their soldiers and attempting to detain them. Upon Key's request, President Madison appointed the young officer to discuss the doctor's release. At this point, the British were preparing their magnificent attack on Fort McHenry, which was the citadel guarding Baltimore's harbor. Dr. Beans was being detained on one of the British ships in the harbor. Key requested the release of the doctor, but was told by a guard that his request would have to wait until after the attack had taken place. This was due to security reasons, because Key had seen the size and structure of the British Armada. He, however, was welcome to visit Beans on board. The British began their iconic naval assault on Fort McHenry on September 14, 1814, and during its course displayed the might and majesty of their military power. Throughout the course of the bombardment, the American flag flew over the fort with diligence, honor, and majesty itself. Its presence reminded everyone involved that the fort remained in American hands. When the sun began to rise, the 35-year-old Key observed the raising of the enormous 30 by 42-foot American flag, which had been sewn by Mary Pickersgill over the fort, affirming that it had not capitulated. British forces, deciding that further bombardment was futile, and also that they had run out of ammunition, moved on, sailing for New Orleans. During the course of the assault, Key had observed the bombardment firsthand. Hands down, he had witnessed one of the most spectacular light shows in history, with a front row seat. On the morning of the bombardment's conclusion, he was inspired to write a patriotic song describing its course from beginning to end. He did so by scribbling words for potential lyrics on the back of a letter. The lyrics of the first stanza projected a broad image of patriotism, war, and a question. They are as follows. Oh, say, can you see, by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched, were so gallantly streaming? And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Though the song contains 4 stanzas, the first one is the exclusive one that most people know. Did you know the Star-Spangled Banner had 4 stanzas? Indeed, it is the sole stanza utilized whenever the anthem is sung. And I know you probably haven't heard the other stanzas ever, okay? Here continuing are the remaining 3 stanzas, including the highly controversial 3rd stanza, in which Key does not hold back in criticizing blacks, free or slave, but primarily enslaved, who had decided to take up arms with the British against the United States. Stanza 2 is as follows. On the shore dimly seen, through the mists of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes, what is that which the breeze, o'er the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected, now shines in the stream. 'Tis the star-spangled banner, O long may it wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Now to stanza 3, which is the controversial one where Key attacks blacks who have decided to fight for the British against the United States. And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out, their foul footsteps pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. And the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. So indeed, he is not holding back in condemning these blacks who have decided to join the British during the War of 1812. So this is the 4th and final stanza. Oh, thus it be ever, where freemen shall stand between their loved home and the war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace. May the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just. And this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Okay? So this patriotic tune, written by Francis Scott Key, thus became a song which indirectly predicted the destiny of the United States. After the British withdrew from Baltimore Harbor and Dr. Beans was released, Key delivered the lyrics to the Baltimore American, a local newspaper. They printed dozens of copies under the title Defense of Fort McHenry. The lyrics, which were eventually put to the British drinking song To Anacreon in Heaven, became incredibly popular among the citizenry, being sung in bars and theaters, an instant hit, if you will. In October of 1814, a theater in Baltimore promoted the song under its new name, the Star-Spangled Banner. In December of 1814, the song would be played for the first time in Washington at a local banquet hosted by dyed-in-the-wool politicos. Despite the fact that it would not become the national anthem until 1931, the song was a national success from the beginning and has arguably remained so ever since. So now we move to Francis Scott Key and African Americans, both enslaved and free. Francis Scott Key had a most interesting and mixed record with respect to black people, putting it plainly. Like many of his era, Key felt that black Americans were generally inferior to whites, mentally and likely in other ways as well. Okay. While not dependent upon whites as a race overall, Key knew this, blacks would essentially be at their mercy in a place such as the United States. He faced the moral dilemma of slavery with conflicting thoughts and actions. While he knew ever since boyhood that the institution was wrong, he himself was a slaveholder, all right, albeit a tremendously humane and virtuous one. Key publicly criticized the brutal treatment of slaves, and later was known as the Black's Lawyer in publications after his death. You might wonder why he gained that title. Well, although Key himself was never an abolitionist, this title came due to his long years of defending slaves seeking freedom, often from cruel and inhumane masters. One particular instance was in 1825, where he represented an African American named James Hurton. This individual was owned by a naval officer and had served him on the ship during his official tour of duty overseas. Naval regulations, however, prohibited the use of slaves on Navy vessels, and thus Hurton had to be paid for his services. When they returned to the United States, he sought his freedom in court. The argument was simple. The fact that he had been paid meant that he was no longer a slave. Acting on behalf of Hurton, Key submitted a letter to the court stating that Hurton's paid tour of duty was tantamount to implied manumission. The court agreed, and Hurton was officially freed that year. Key would also manumit 7 of his slaves in the 1830s, thanks largely to Nat Turner's 1831 slave revolt in Virginia, one of which remained as the paid supervisor of his farm. As one of the executors of John Randolph of Roanoke's estate, he fought to enforce the provisions of the will, which freed Randolph's 400 slaves and provided them with land to support themselves. On at least one occasion, Key spoke out publicly against the brutality against enslaved people, right, as I mentioned earlier. With this conflict bore more conflict. While approving of freedom for African Americans who had obtained it in various means, he thought that with few exceptions, most blacks did not know how to prosper in freedom among whites. Of his manumitted bondsmen, he wrote that several slaves in which he freed, only one did not thrive in their freedom. In another account, he reflected that in his time, having been party to the liberation of many slave families, he told a friend, "I cannot remember more than 2 instances out of this large number in which it did not appear that the freedom so earnestly sought for them was their ruin." Through time, Key had formed the opinion that many free blacks were shiftless and untrustworthy, a nuisance, if not a menace to white people. That's largely an opinion founded on the, fact that many of these free blacks had not been properly prepared for freedom and had turned to illicit activities, largely because they would be denied unemployment and had to survive somehow. So it wasn't their fault, all right? Key, however, was quite the opposite and had arguably prepared his own bondsmen for freedom. Hence why he had the opinion, as I just gave, that his own bondsmen did so well in freedom versus the bondsmen of others that he sought to liberate. Not hard to see. In 1838, when responding to a letter asking for his opinion of how Southern religious institutions felt about slavery, he responded in saying that American blacks who had been released from servitude were a distinct and inferior race of people, which all experience proves to be the greatest evil that afflicts a community. These views represented those who felt that free blacks could not remain here even as paid employees, and were not the views of Key himself. So that statement was not Key's personal view, but Key's opinion of what Southern religious institutions felt about slavery and free blacks. Perhaps those blacks who were an evil afflicting a community, like I said, had either provided significant economic competition to whites or had turned to a life of illicit activities. The most plausible reason is that they destroyed the image that blacks were unable to be self-sufficient outside of being slaves. Most free blacks did not fall into such degrading categories, and by stark contrast, lived as productive, if not essential, members of society throughout the United States. Whatever the roots and conflicts of Key's beliefs, all right, he felt that the American Colonization Society was one avenue of relief for free American blacks. Founded in 1816, this society worked to assist in the return of freed American blacks to Africa. Anyone see anything wrong with this? Yeah, me too. The organization was controversial from the beginning. All right? Many free blacks accepted the offer, but most African Americans did not want to leave their homeland for a place they knew nothing of, regardless of how rough it was for them in the U.S. Additionally, many whites agreed with them that it was simply wrong to expatriate American-born blacks after exploiting their labor and that of their ancestors for nearly 2 centuries prior. This was their nation just as much as any white person. Other whites opposed the society as they wisely understood just how dependent the U.S. was on the labor of free blacks. To export a crucial segment of the nation's workforce made no economic sense. Illogical, quite simply put. Many prominent figures of the day, such as former Presidents Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, also saw this as a way to absolve the nation of the guilt of slavery and returning blacks to Africa, all right, where their ancestors had been stolen from. The problem was that very few blacks in the U.S. in 1816 could call Africa their place of origin. Keep in mind, the international slave trade, while still going on, the U.S. had pulled out of it in 1808, all right? And most American blacks at that point still had been living here for 2, 3, 4 generations or more. So they didn't know anything about Africa. That's some far-off, distant place in their minds. They never knew that. Now, if it was a century earlier, that might have been different. But in 1816, nah. Okay? And because of that, the American Colonization Society never gained the support that it thought it would. By the 1830s, there was more opposition to it than ever before. Though Key was a member, he never sought to personally remove any blacks from the United States to Africa, which had received emancipation by way of his hands. Although he was removed from the board of directors in 1833, as the society became more abolitionist in its intent, Key supported it until his death 10 years later. So now we move to Key as a presidential advisor, career attorney, and U.S. attorney. During business hours, Francis Scott Key was a highly successful attorney at law. His firm represented claimants of the War Department as well as the Land Office. Such clients were rarely indigent and often paid Key $1,000 for his services, no small sum at the time. These cases were typically argued at the nearby courthouse or at the U.S. Supreme Court, which was at that time located in the U.S. Capitol building. Over time, his influence, largely bolstered by the popularity of his lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner, led him into the thicket of presidential politics. With the election of Andrew Jackson to the presidency in 1828, he offered his services to the new administration. Key would be a trusted confidant of the president for the remainder of Jackson's time in the White House. Additionally, it was largely through Key's efforts that his brother-in-law and very close friend, Roger Brooke Taney, rose to the heights of prominence that he did attain. Beginning in 1831, President Jackson required the resignation of all of his cabinet. Jackson, who had admired Taney's legal skills up to that point, wanted to nominate him for the position of Attorney General. Before doing so, however, he sought the advice of Key, who approved of the choice, and after some mild delay with the incumbent, the nomination went through. On June 23, 1831, Roger B. Taney was named the Attorney General of the United States. Upon winning re-election in 1832, President Jackson sought to repay his political debt to the trusted Francis Scott Key. His recommendation of Taney to the cabinet had been a bumper crop of fortune for the president on all things legal, including the destruction of the National Bank, removal of Native Americans, and the laws of the sea. With this record, Jackson wanted an equally reliable man to handle the legal affairs of the nation's capital. Thus, on January 29, 1833, he formally nominated Key to be the Attorney of the United States for Washington City, the equivalent of a DA. The prominent Key was unanimously confirmed by the Senate on the same day. Overall, the position did not fit the personality of Key himself, who was neither vindictive nor prosecutorial. He did, however, overcome his initial reluctance with a clear and decisive vision of justice for for Washington, D.C. Upon the death of Chief Justice John Marshall in July of 1835, Key lobbied hard for the appointment of Taney to replace the judicial legend. His efforts bore fruit when his brother-in-law was confirmed by the Senate to the position the following year. Taney, who was of course the author of the infamous Dred Scott decision in 1857, among many other nation-forming decisions, would serve until his death in October of 1864, near the end of the American Civil War. Washington had its fair share of problems during this era, some worse than others. Aside from the common issues of theft and fighting, there were ever-growing problems of bawdy houses and gambling establishments. Both of these institutions were officially unlawful in the capital, but enforcement was scarce, and most of them flourished. Key declared war on them both, however, especially the bawdy houses, shutting down establishments owned by black, white, male, and female. Key did not discriminate when it came to illicit behavior and prosecuted all involved with the same zeal. During this time, upon Jackson's request, Key represented various individuals of interest to the administration. His success led to the real development of their mutual trust. When it came to the subject of the abolitionist movement, he was much less even-handed, however. In spite of his own conflicting views on slavery and black people in general, his actions as a DA tended to favor the interests of slavery and slaveholders. In 1833, Key indicted a free black school teacher named John Prout for forging paperwork that allowed for the freedom of a young black couple. Upon conviction, Mr. Prout was required to leave the district. Also that year, he indicted abolitionist Benjamin Lundy for a seemingly libelous publication. Lundy had written a story stating that Key's police force had chased a helpless black woman to the Potomac, where she later drowned. Additionally, he wrote of the event, "There is no justice or mercy for colored people in the district." Refusing to be tried by a Southern jury, Lundy would flee the nation's capital. Perhaps the most famous instance was the trial of Reuben Crandall in 1835. In the case known as U.S. versus Reuben Crandall, Crandall, who was an abolitionist from Connecticut, had been indicted by Key on 5 criminal counts, including libel and attempting to incite violence and slave insurrection by distributing abolitionist literature. Where Crandall had an excellent defense team led by Cox and Bradley, Key's prosecution was poorly prepared and dismally led. I would rightly argue that he poorly prosecuted Crandall intentionally so that he would be acquitted. I don't know. You can debate me on that one. It's fine. So throughout the proceeding, Key had failed to prove that Crandall had the criminal intent to disturb the literature which he possessed. Despite his many attempts to prove this fact against the defense, it bore no fruit. The jury returned with a verdict of not guilty, and Crandall left Washington shortly thereafter to his parents' home in Connecticut. So this takes us to Key's final years and his legacy. After the acquittal of Reuben Crandall, Francis Key's reputation was significantly weakened, and any future political prospects, if he sought them, were not likely. Adding to this, his son Daniel was killed in a duel by a fellow naval officer in June of 1836. Adhering to his ever-present strong faith in God, Key concluded that the death of his son was the mandate of the Divine Father for some unexplained reason. His ambition thereafter was all but gone. After Andrew Jackson left office in March of 1837, President Martin Van Buren, number 8 by the way, retained Key in his position as U.S. Attorney for Washington City, a position which Key held until his resignation in 1840. Key maintained his private law practice and a consistent profile until his death on January 11th, 1843, due to complications from pneumonia. He was 63 years of age. The legacy left by Francis Scott Key is one which historians can rightly debate in great detail. Like many prominent men of his era, he held many conflicting beliefs and engaged in dubious practices with respect to Black Americans. This is especially true in his views on slavery. Deep down, like I said, Key knew that slavery was wrong, as evidenced by the manumission of many of his slaves throughout his lifetime. In spite of that, he remained a lifelong slaveholder. He supported colonizing free blacks in Africa if they wished to go, but never argued that they should go or must go. Though he knew slavery was wrong and did free many of his own slaves, Francis Scott Key was never an abolitionist and even prosecuted people for engaging in abolitionist activities while city attorney for Washington. All right. So contrasting this on more than one occasion, he represented blacks who were suing for their freedom and won it. That said, as you can clearly see, Francis Scott Key is a difficult figure to place in any singular category. But what can be said is that he treated each situation differently without being an ideologue. Without question, he played an influential role in the American slavery debate, for better or for worse. To the Star-Spangled Banner, his place in history is more steady. He will forever be remembered by the singular event of his early life. It was at the Battle of Baltimore and Key's being at the right place at the right time that propelled him into history and made him the American legend that he is. Virtually all of his role in authorizing the Star-Spangled Banner is without blemish, except the third stanza of the song, which reflected his inner demons. That stanza, of course, as we read, expressed a profound criticism of blacks who had joined the ranks of the British Army against the U.S. during the War of 1812. Had he never written this verse, there would be no unusual charges to levy against Key with respect to racism and slavery that wouldn't be applicable to thousands of others during the times in which he lived. He, however, was different, as he wrote a poem that would eventually become a song that in turn would become the American national anthem. That song speaks of America successfully resisting a British assault on the nation, preserving its freedom. In the third stanza, however, Key does not feel that these blacks who ran behind British lines were justified in the name of freedom. For this, Key bears a much heavier burden than the average affluent slaveholder for his day, who was riddled with mixed actions, as Key wrote a song of freedom. Last but certainly not least, it was Francis Scott Key who essentially propelled his brother-in-law, Roger B. Taney, to national fame. Responsible for his rise, all right, Key is the man who recommended Taney for U.S. Attorney General in 1831, and then as Chief Justice in 1835. For better or for worse, Francis Scott Key indirectly propelled Taney to national fame. Taney, of course, would issue some of the most profoundly pro-slavery opinions as Attorney General and later as a member of the Supreme Court as its Chief Justice. Without Key, it is highly unlikely that Taney would have ever reached any of these heights. Given Taney's mixed legacy, depending on who you talk to, this can serve to Key's credit or blemish. Thus, Francis Scott Key was a man whose legacy as an individual will vary greatly from person to person. He made his successful accomplishments, all right, and had many of them, but also had his shares of failures and shortcomings. Nonetheless, the story of Francis Scott Key, which lasted from 1779 to 1843, must be told and told truthfully. His positive deeds do him justice, while his negative ones pull him down and lead us to question how he truly felt on many issues. Was he an honorable man riddled with conflict, torn apart by inner demons, or just a typical man of his era who, by virtue of the Star-Spangled Banner, was just in the right place at the right time? As Key is very difficult to place in any singular category with respect to slavery, with respect to free African Americans, all right, and with respect to, many issues of the time. Historians can truly debate, analyze, and research about Francis Scott Key and present our findings for you, for your own objective analysis. So I thank you very much for watching and listening to this somewhat brief biographical account and analysis of Francis Scott Key, Esquire, the man beyond the Star-Spangled Banner. Hopefully you learned more about Francis Scott Key from this video than you have ever known about him in your life to date. So I thank you so much again for listening. If you have not subscribed to my channel at this point, please do so now, Warresley Shelton, M.A. And if you like this video, enjoyed it, gained some insight, knowledge, please drop me a like. You know, that truly matters, ladies and gentlemen, in the process of growing a YouTube channel. So again, thank you so much. I want you to take care of yourselves, stay safe out there, be blessed, and I'll talk to you at the next video. Peace.